Hey everyone, it's Allie, and with the patch notes being released for the 1.1 season, we can now see the full might of the Sorc mini rework, and oh my god, it's going to be so good. I was originally planning to play a Sorc for 1.1 no matter what, even if it didn't really gain many buffs, and I am so glad I decided to stick with it because wow, they are making Sorc into an insane class. Sorc has been something that hasn't really been touched by the devs in a few years at this point, and it was one of the oldest specs in the game, which didn't really have much support for it. Back in the day, it used to be really overpowered because it had a mechanic that mitigated a portion of all damage you take by making it hit your mana pool instead, and it used to work with endurance, which used to make Sorc and mana stackers really good, but they had to completely remove it from the game because it was such an overpowered mechanic that they couldn't really find a way to nicely balance it. Ever since then, Sorc has just kind of been a weird spot where it hasn't been very good, and with this rework, they've completely fixed that, and Sorc is now going to be back in the meta. So what I want to do today is go over all the changes, discuss them with you guys, show you why Sorc is going to be so strong, and potentially get you into considering playing a Sorc yourself. The first thing that we should go over is probably a meta-analysis of how Sorc currently does in comparison to Spellblade and most importantly Runemaster. The issue that Sorc has been having is an early game issue. Late game Sorc is still okay because you can stack enough mana and abuse the current mana stacking defensive layers to actually gain a pretty solid amount of EHP, but early game you basically had access to nothing as the mana stacking scalars were either not available as you needed transient fates to really get your word going, or were just not really that good at very low mana values. Because of this, Sorc always had an issue, and I want to say that's honestly a big portion of why it wasn't really very popular to start as a class, because you just have issues with it where, you know, Runemaster just gets Rowan's Frostguard for free and has hundreds of word while they level on top of all of the other word on hit they get. The same goes for Spellblade, where Spellblade gets access to quite a lot of word on hit early on their passive tree, just allowing them to not really have much issue with both their recovery and with them having a large enough pool to tank a bunch of hits. Well, all of that is actually going to be changing next season. We are now going to be getting Mana Shell right at the start of the Sorcerer tree. Mana Shell at 5 points is going to give you 10 word per second, and then another 1 word per second per 10 maximum mana. With the 50 mana that Sorc is going to be gaining from its passive, and the 100 or so mana that you should have around level 20 for just existing, plus maybe a few mana rolls in a gear, you can very easily hit around 200 mana exactly when you get Mana Shell, allowing you to basically just have 22 word per second for free. This is going to be exceptionally strong with the new word formula, as word per second is not only just better now, but word overall is substantially stronger at less than 4,000 word than it was before. As we can see here in 1.0, if we use the Tunk Lab calculator, which would be in the description, if I had 22 word per second, it would stabilize at 55. Well, with the new 1.1 formula, this 55 word now stabilizes at 107. This would effectively give you 30% more life at an early level, which is going to be more than enough to make Sorc feel really good through the first few chapters. The only defensive layer that Sorc had access to early on was Lost Knowledge, which was at 15 passive points, which was around the time you got to Majelka. Because this gives you ward based on your current mana, and you're most likely going to constantly have mana issues and be near low mana, this really isn't going to do much, and you couldn't really rely on this. But now we have Mana Shell to get us the Lost Knowledge, and then Lost Knowledge plus Mana Shell together are actually going to make for a pretty solid duo to keeping you alive until endgame. Because of this, Sorc's viability has massively exploded, as it's not going to be a pain in the ass to level it when we add in the changes to its passive. Normally, Sorc's passive gave it 1% increased spell damage per 1 additional mana cost on whatever skill you casted. It is now being reworked into 1% more damage per 2 mana for your given skill, up to a maximum of 50%. This is substantially better, increasing Sorc's early on damage by somewhere around 30%. You're most likely going to either be leveling with Static Orb, which is going to cost somewhere around 40 mana by default, or you're going to be leveling with Meteor, which is going to cost around 70 mana. The thing about Static Orb, especially on a mana stacker, is you're very heavily incentivized to go with Mana Charge, which is going to increase the cost of Static Orb by quite a lot, allowing you to boost the mana cost of it to the point where you can fully utilize the passive. The same thing can go for Meteor, where you can pick up Twin Meteors and have Meteor cost over 130 mana, giving you a pretty hefty chunk of the total passive. Because of this and the ability for you to be able to scale your mana costs, Sorc is going to do a lot more damage than it was previously able to, and with the defensive layers that it's going to get, it's going to have a very easy time leveling through the campaign. Now, as we start pushing into monoliths and start pushing into endgame, Sorc gets a lot of really nice new additions to help it push it all the way through everything it needs to get to until it can get to the super late game idealized version of the build. We have Mana Bulwark, which is another new mana mana node, pushing Sorc's total mana potential even higher. It's going to make it so 20% of damage dealt to you is going to be dealt to mana before health. This eventually is not going to be very good, as this does not work with ward, but until you get those really large ward values in the end game, this effectively comes out to be basically 20% more health. This should feel really comfy, and when you stack it with the new Elixir of Knowledge, it's going to give you 3 ward per int whenever you press a health potion. Every potion should basically be a mini defensive layer. You're not going to really have to rely on Elixir of Knowledge, but it is a nice to have, as we pretty much want to pick up every little bit of mana regen on the tree, and this does come with a little bit of mana regen. Finally, as we start pushing towards empowered monoliths, we are then going to get ourselves Mana Well, which is one of the new capstone nodes at the end of the Sorc tree. This is going to give us up to 15% increased mana, which is a very rare stat. Any sort of percent increased mana we want to immediately fit into our build if possible, which is going to massively boost the amount of total mana most Sorc builds are going to have, pushing the average 1.5 to 2,000 mana build up another 200 or so mana, while at the same time coming with a free mini defensive layer on it of 50% of all mana we spend being gained as board. Typically, as a mid-game Sorc, you're going to be spending about 200 mana or so per second, giving you another 100 mana on top of the fact that Mana Shell is still stacking and it itself potentially giving you around 150 ward per second. Suddenly, Sorc has gone from gaining no word per second anywhere in its tree to basically having a baseline 250 or so word per second. Now, again, it's not going to be super consistent, as a portion of that is through mana gained as word, but if we were to look at what that would look like in Tunk Labs, if we had 250 word per second, that is a constant stable 1000 word with no word retention. Realistically, you're going to have around 20 or so intelligence at a minimum, meaning that you are going to be gaining yourself at a minimum 80 word retention, pushing this 1000 stable word that Sorc never had access to all the way up to 1.3k. Just this alone is enough to get you to a point where you can get yourself Transient Fate and other endgame items, and then as soon as you get those items, you'll have no issue being able to both abuse Transient Fate, Twisted Heart, and the baseline Sorc increases to make yourself super tanky and to very easily be able to hold about 10,000 word. If it actually wasn't for the word decay nerfs, Sorc with all these changes would easily be able to hold around 20 to 25,000 word, but it is what it is, and we can still very easily hit at minimum 10 to 12,000 word, depending on how heavy your mana costs are and depending on how far you are in your build with how much mana you have. So with all the defensive layers completely taken care of, where's the damage? Well, the single best node in the game, and I truly mean this, I do not think there's a single better passive node in the game other than this, Archmage, has been massively buffed. What Archmage used to do before is just give you 5 flat spell damage, with it getting tripled if you had 200 maximum mana, to where it's now going to also refund 20% of your mana costs, with it doubling and tripling at certain mana values. This means at 1,000 mana, you always just refund 20% of your mana, and this by itself is going to allow you to push Sorc's ability to do a lot of DPS by a very large margin. A good example of this is going to be Meteor. A typical Meteor setup used twin Meteors and pushed the average mana cost of Meteor up to 130. The problem with that is you can barely get off 5, 6, 7 Meteors in a typical mana stacking build before you completely ran out of mana to be able to cast more. It was very close to you being able to sustain a large amount of Meteor usage through stacking a large amount of mana regen and through using Aftermath to reduce the cost of your Meteor. Well, this 20% mana refund is that slight little bit that it needed to push it over the edge to being able to basically permanently sustain Meteors, especially as you push into very high mana levels. I have done a lot of math on this specific node just to see exactly how good it is. Here on screen, you can see a chart of the DPS increase at different cast speeds and different mana values for just having Archmage in a typical mid-game Sorcerer setup. As you can see, in most cases, it's about 10 to 15% increased damage, with it getting better the more cast speed you have. Because this node does not care about how many casts you're doing, because you're constantly getting mana per cast that you do, it is going to massively increase the amount of mana that you actually have for Meteor, as typically the only way you previously were able to deal with its mana costs was specifically through Aftermath, which had the downside of it resetting every time you used another Meteor. If you want to look at another chart, this is going to be the additional amounts of extra seconds that you can hold down your Meteor key with Archmage over not having Archmage. As you can see, at 1 cast per second, the amount of additional seconds you can cast Meteor for is going to be crazy. Now, you might be saying, Allie, 1 cast per second is not very reasonable. You're not going to be doing that very often, but you will be for doing echoes. The normal Meteor playstyle is typically to just go up to a monster, press a Meteor once, and then move on to the next pack. Realistically, you're most likely casting less than a Meteor per second, with the only time where you're casting more is whenever you get to a rare monster, potentially pressing 2 or maybe 3 Meteors in total. A big clunkiness of Sorc and a Meteor build, for example, has been that you constantly had to stop to focus to get all of your mana back. Well, because you're getting 20, 30 additional seconds before you actually go you barely have to press focus no more than maybe once or twice, if even that, per echo that you're going to do with Archmage. And because of this, you are now going to have a very, very comfortable time. If you want to see the differences between time to go at different values, here are two separate charts that are going to show this. The first chart is how many seconds you would have been able to cast Meteor for with no Archmage, and the second one showcases you the amount of time you're going to be able to cast it with Archmage. As you can see, specifically in the 1 cast per second column, you are almost doubling the total amount of time that you're able to cast it for, meaning you only have to press half as many focuses as you did before, massively increasing the quality of life of your build. Obviously, this number is going to get smaller and smaller as we push the higher and higher cast per second because the mana costs are going to be so extreme that you can't really sustain it for very long. But the point is, at anywhere between 1 to 1.5 casts per second, which is going to be the average expected cast per second for an Echo, the playstyle and the feel of Meteor is going to massively be increased. Now, I know I'm mostly talking about Meteor here, but this is also going to apply to Static Orb, which I can very easily see this making meta once again. Static Orb was really popular in 0.9, but unfortunately fell out of favor simply due to the fact that it got nerfed pretty massively, especially with the dot ground you used to put down on the ground, and because of that, a lot of people gave up, especially because Rin Master also came out, which just was, well, very broken. What I'm trying to say here with Archmage is not only is it going to increase the damage of the build, as we can see, we're gaining anywhere between 10 to 15% more damage, but when paired with the new mastery, which is on average going to give you somewhere around 35 to 40% more damage versus the 100 increase from before, which was maybe at most 5% damage, Sorc is looking at anywhere between a 35 to 40% DPS increase just from Archmage existing in the game and making its mana problems a lot easier to deal with, and from the mastery getting massively reworked. I am really excited to put all this together, and I'm really excited about all the math behind Archmage. And to me, it's just so fun that Archmage has so much involved math behind it that actually makes it substantially better than it looks on paper, that I have absolutely fallen in love with Sorcerer. The TLDR, if we want to wrap up everything together, is now that your campaign leveling is not going to be the most miserable thing in the game, because it by far was miserable in comparison to everything else, while at the same time your mid-game echo pushing while you're getting yourselves to empowered monoliths is going to be super comfy, where before it was kind of sketchy and you're prone to dying quite a lot. And then finally, in the end game, once we're stacking mana and once we're ready to spend hundreds and hundreds of mana per second, we have a very nice way of staying alive on top of us gaining massive DPS increases in comparison to what we had before. Because of this, it is in my honest opinion that Sorc is going to be the best of the 3 mage masteries in the game, and I honestly believe that Sorc is most likely the single best mastery in the game, period. I am super excited to start my league starter with this, and if you too are hooked on Sorcerer and you're interested in everything I talked about today, I will be having my build guide launched for Meteor mana stacking in about a day or two if you want to follow along and have fun and break the game just like how we broke the game with Falconeer last season. If you have any questions or want to discuss any of this further, feel free to leave a comment in the comments below. I also stream on Twitch every single day, so feel free to come by Twitch and ask me any questions you have there. Or if you simply just want to come and hang out with all the other cuties and be a part of our community, I'd be more than happy to see you there as well. With all that said, cuties, I hope you enjoy. I hope you have fun in the next season, Last Epoch, with whatever build you play, and I hope to see cuties in the next video.